Should the United States continue to guarantee the security of states like Japan and South Korea?
Yeah.
On this, I suspect my own answer probably differs from that of many of the rest of the panel, and that I would say yes. I would say that it's a comparatively cheap way of preventing instabilities and miscalculations that are potentially more problematic and dangerous than they are elsewhere. North Korea is probably the wildest and craziest state in the world. The American deterrent function there for the past 60 plus years is probably worth continuing just because of the complete unpredictability of what might happen otherwise. Japan, happily, is basically protected by a water buffer, which doesn't take much in terms of requirements of normal military security. And having Japan take full responsibility for its own interests militarily is probably not worth the trouble it would cause in the region.
I mean, you began by saying others will disagree. Who disagrees with that?
I definitely do.
I disagree. Yeah, a little bit. I mean, we have to remember that North Korea created a nuclear deterrent under primacy, under the idea that the United States was preventing nuclear proliferation, and yet it didn't. What I say is that primacy has done a really good job of discouraging nuclear proliferation among our friends, and it's done a sort of lousy job about preventing it against our enemies, potential enemies. And so we have to take the good with the bad, and I have to say that I am a lot less worried about a Japan with nuclear weapons or a South Korea with nuclear weapons than I am with a Pakistan with nuclear weapons. And yet, our current posture is to look unkindly to any new country acquiring a nuclear weapon. Is that right? Is that wise? I'm not so sure about that.
I have to say, I'm with Dick. It seems to me that any kind of precipitous U.S. military withdrawal from the region is likely to have destabilizing effects.
Well, so I mean, you could make it precipitous or you could make it graceful in some way. Like it's hard to convince other countries to take seriously that we're really leaving if you don't make some abrupt shift. So this is a delicate issue, but you don't have to intentionally leave countries in the lurch to say, you know, other countries actually can take care of themselves. So Japan is a tremendously rich country with a moat in an era when military technology is becoming more defensively oriented.
Isn't that another declining power?
Yeah. So, but by this, in the same way that China is,
yes.
right? I mean, they are both getting older. They are both having their internal issues, right? So it's not obvious to me that, given the advantages of being on the defense, that Japan's just totally out of the game. And my reaction to Dick's point, which is probably right, that North Korea is a wild and crazy place, is that I don't want to be next to the wild and crazy place. Like, the wilder and crazier they are, the further away that I would like to be. And I am totally grateful that there's a Pacific Ocean between them and me. And
this is where we want to be smart, right? So if we care at all about balancing against a rising China, then you're going to want to have allies in Asia. You're going to need allies in Asia, so we'd want to maintain the connections to Japan and South Korea and get them to pull their weight. If you're worried about North Korea and its nuclear weapons, though, this is a place where we actually want to pass the buck to China, which has some leverage over North Korea that we lack. And the one thing that might get China to take that problem more seriously is if they thought maybe the United States wasn't going to insulate everybody from the consequences of North Korea's bomb by giving them missile defense. Right. And actually maybe South Korea might go nuclear, and maybe Japan might go nuclear too, because they were worried about North Korea. And if China doesn't like the idea of those countries having nuclear weapons, and it doesn't, maybe it would start to do more to help us with the North Korea problem, instead of, once again, Washington saying it will solve all of these problems by itself.
But Gene, we're not leaving Asia, right? We're going to be there. How much buck passing we do is open to debate. But the reason you don't want Japan and South Korea to have nuclear weapons is you don't want them to have a finger on a nuclear trigger. Because you could have a crisis, for example, over the Senkaku Islands in the East China Sea that could escalate and drag us in.
So there are two different questions, right? So there's the nuclear question is a meaningful question, which we could discuss on that. But the original question is, do we want to have our current alliance with Japan and South Korea? And that is a sort of a different question from the question of, are we happier with them having nuclear weapons. Like these are countries that, you posited earlier that Japan would get swamped by China absent the United States. And I don't think that's as obvious, right? So Japan is a technologically sophisticated, capable country with the ability to generate defensive military power that's meaningful, right? So they're in the game. Like there's something that you could there's a middle ground that you could take between saying Japan's only hope is aggressive nuclearization.
And there's still the potential for a dispute over the Senkaku Islands between a nuclear-armed United States and a nuclear-armed China. I'm not convinced that the likelihood of an escalatorial spiral is only going to occur in the event that Japan is more on its own. Maybe their better deterrent would convince the Chinese to negotiate a resolution to those disputed territories, as opposed to believing that the United States, believing correctly, that the United States doesn't really care about those rocks badly enough to fight over it.
It seems to me that a nuclear-armed Japan and a nuclear-armed Republic of Korea are the vehicles for buck passing in Asia, for a buck passing strategy. Any deterrent threat that I make on my own behalf is going to be more credible than any deterrent threat you make on my behalf.
I fully understand that.
Yeah, that's right. So I don't really,
John's petrified of China.
I'm not petrified of China. My
just
point
thinks we're
was
gonna
simply
fight.
you don't want the South Koreans and the Japanese to have their finger
I'm making
on a nuclear trigger. The same logic applied in the Cold War.
Wait a second, John. You don't want them to have their fingers on the trigger if we're carrying the weight of containing China. If they have their fingers on their own trigger, we don't have to carry the weight of containing China. That's the choice that will ultimately be
So if
posed.
China continues to rise, you're in favor of pulling back to the United States?
I'm saying that there's two ways to go. I haven't really decided what I want to do yet, but I'm saying there's two ways to go. One is to genuinely empower the locals to deal with the Chinese threat, and genuine empowerment means having their own nuclear weapons and getting our troops out of their countries. And I think that the risk of this happening is actually a pretty important concern for China. Right? I don't think that's necessarily their preferred outcome. I think it's a very interesting and promising way to contain China on the cheap. And if China turns out to be this colossus that some people fear, I don't think we're going to want to run a containment strategy against China the way we ran the containment strategy against Russia.
And how much of this is right? And how much of this is path dependence? If we hadn't had this situation during the Cold War, would we be sitting here going, you know what? We really need to conclude an alliance with South Korea because, man, otherwise we're not going to be safe and secure. And I just have a hard time believing that.
The United States has a rich history of preventing hegemons in Europe and Asia, or Eurasia in the case of the Cold War. We didn't tolerate the idea of Imperial Germany, Imperial Japan, Nazi Germany, or the Soviet Union dominating either Europe or
but
Asia.
most of those were in the era before nuclear weapons.
One was not.
One
and that
wasn't.
was the Soviet Union.
Right, but
and
that's
we
a very
contained the
specific
Soviet
case,
Union. And
right.
there's all sorts of evidence we're going to contain China. The idea that we're going to come back to the United States is not in the cards.
Well, but that's an is-odd difference, right?
No,
we probably will,
Yeah, but I
should
thought
we?
you were a realist, Will.
Well, a realist can be an isolationist, right? You can make an argument for coming back to the United States. And it's
My
a
only point is, if you want to try a buck passing strategy in Asia, the buck passing strategy is open to you, and it's dependent upon nuclear proliferation to
Spread.
Japan and to the Republic of Korea. And given what I believe about nuclear weapons, I don't think I have to work very hard after that to ensure that China doesn't become the hegemon of Asia.